When it comes to figuring out our risk of heart disease, pretty much everybody agrees that ApoB is a more reliable metric than LDL cholesterol, even though it's less commonly measured, less commonly reported, but it's more precise. If you're not sure what ApoB is, we have a lot of videos going over that in detail, but it's basically a count of the number of particles in our blood that can cause heart disease. So in general, the higher the number of particles, the higher the ApoB, the higher the risk. Now, we don't have as much data for ApoB. Studies that report ApoB in this field are less common than for LDL cholesterol. And in fact, guidelines for cardiovascular disease prevention or management much more commonly report LDL cholesterol thresholds, LDL cholesterol goals. So this creates a conundrum. If ApoB is the better metric, but most guidelines give you LDL cholesterol goals, how do we know what we're shooting for with ApoB? What are the goals? What are the cutoffs that we're aiming for? So I went over a number of data sets, a number of studies that report both LDL cholesterol and ApoB. So here's a way to simplify and conceptualize this question, basically by separating people into three buckets, three categories, depending on our risk. On one end of the spectrum, we have people with very low risk. Blood pressure is pretty good, no diabetes, no crazy family history, not a lot of uncles or grandparents having heart attacks or strokes. So not a very remarkable history. For this crowd, I would try to keep ApoB under 90 milligrams per deciliter. This corresponds to about 100 milligrams per deciliter LDL cholesterol. That's ballpark. Bear in mind, these metrics sometimes mismatch. And when they do, some people have LDL cholesterol and ApoBs that are quite different from each other. And when that happens, LDL cholesterol is not a reliable metric of risk, but ApoB is. So 90 milligrams per deciliter ApoB, a pretty chill, not a very strict cutoff. Under 90, some people will still grow plaque, but it'll usually be people who have other risk factors or who have a lot of susceptibility, just a genetic propensity. So for somebody who doesn't have any other concerns, any other risk factors, and family history seems pretty clean, it's not, heart disease is not something that happens very often in the person's family. 90 is kind of a chill, not very aggressive cutoff. Bear in mind that if you look at if you've had your ApoB measured, you look at your lab work, just like any other metric, there will be a reference range. And some labs will say under 100 milligrams per deciliter is normal. Some will go even higher, under 120, under 130. These values are entirely based on the distribution in the population on percentiles. So 100 milligrams per deciliter ApoB is roughly the 50th percentile for a Western population. 120 to 130 is about 85th percentile, around there. So in a population where heart disease is the #1 cause of death, being just on the average of ApoB or much higher than average is not exactly bragging rights. Hence, a cutoff that is lower than this reference range that is often given in lab work. So 90 milligrams per deciliter, trying to stay under that for people with low risk. Okay, on the other end of the spectrum, we have people with the highest concern, the nightmare cases, people who have already had a heart attack or a stroke. So very high risk. They're trying to avoid another event, another heart attack or another stroke. So we call this secondary prevention. So this is a population where there's not a lot of mystery there. We know they have the disease. We know it's advanced. We know it's vulnerable plaque. They're susceptible. So suggested cutoff here under 60 milligrams per deciliter ApoB. This corresponds roughly to 55 milligrams per deciliter LDL cholesterol. And we have a couple large randomized trials showing that for this crowd with very high risk, pushing their LDL cholesterol into that range under 55 lowers their risk of having another event significantly. So hence this suggested cutoff of 60 for ApoB. Some people argue that these cutoffs are not strict enough, that there's a benefit in going even lower, that the lower the better. So this is debatable. It's not written in stone, but this is a reference cutoff. 60 ApoB, if you have very high risk, if you've had an event before, You don't want to be much higher above that. Okay, here's a question that might come up. Why not push everybody under 60? Just all humans from birth, push everybody under 60, slam the risk factor, eradicate the disease. Most people, unless you have some pretty special genetics, you won the genetic lottery, most people can't get that low naturally, just with lifestyle, with diet and exercise. And so you'd need pharmacological tools to get that low. And so when that comes into play, there's a cost consideration, there's potential side effects for a percentage of people. So you have to consider risk benefit. And for people who are early enough in the process, they're taking precautions before things get out of hand, I don't think it's necessary. Okay, so we got the low risk, we got the high risk, then we got everybody in between, right? The intermediate class. They have some concerns, but it's not quite a red alert yet. So maybe high blood pressure or diabetes or a non-zero calcium score. For this crowd, I keep it under 70 milligrams per deciliter ApoB. When we look at where we see plaque stop growing, it's usually around 70 to 80 milligrams per deciliter LDL cholesterol. So above that, we see plaque growing, and the higher the cholesterol in ApoB, the faster the plaque will grow. And then under that, we actually see plaque shrink. We call that regression. So this cutoff corresponds to an ApoB of about 70 milligrams per deciliter. So it's a good reference range for someone with some concerns, trying to stay under that. By the way, this intermediate class is where I sit. My manageable risk factors are under control. Blood pressure is good, usually 110, 115 systolic. Fasting glucose, low, 70, 75 milligrams per deciliter. Exercise all the time. Diet, dialed in. Don't smoke. So those things are under control. My ApoB naturally, with diet and exercise, all the boxes checked, sits around 80 milligrams per deciliter. So if I had no other concerns, I'd probably be fine with that. And then just keep an eye on imaging of the arteries with age, right? And I'd probably be okay with that. However, we have two genetic risk factors. We have a very high LPA, several-fold higher than the normal range, and there's no way currently to bring that down to the normal range. And then we also have a kidney disease, polycystic kidney. So both of those are risk factors for heart disease later in life. Both of those are exclusively or overwhelmingly determined genetically. So because of those, my risk is higher than it would be if I didn't have them, obviously. So I want to have my manageable risk factors a bit lower and my ApoB under 70. So right now my ApoB is in the mid-60s, 65 or so, with 10 milligrams of rosuvastatin. That's what I've been doing lately. Next, I'm going to play with half the dose of the statin and an ezetimibe coupled with it to see if I get better results or not. But that ballpark of the ApoB, mid-60s, for my context, for my risk factors, I'm quite happy with that. Like I said, none of these cutoffs are written in stone, and some people argue for more aggressive cutoffs. And going forward, as we learn more, as more data comes out, this might absolutely change. Also, if you don't have an ApoB measurement, they're pretty easy to get nowadays and pretty cheap. I think the last time I measured it was like $15, $20, the equivalent of. But if you don't have an ApoB measurement, another thing you can look at that is almost as good, pretty equivalent, is non-HDL cholesterol. So you take basic lipid panel, you take your total cholesterol, subtract your HDL cholesterol, that gives you your non-HDL cholesterol, and it's virtually as reliable, virtually as robust as ApoB as a metric of heart disease risk. And the corresponding values for non-HDL cholesterol are 130, 100, and 85. For a lot more information on ApoB, check out this previous video right here, and what causes heart disease in the first place. We have a whole video on that. Check it out right here. I'll meet you in there. Bye-bye.